Look at what I have. This is my new batch of rum. For those of you who are new here or clicked on this video by chance, my name is Robin, and my rum brand called Rum et al. Is all about experimentation and transparency. I try to craft rums in a way that highlights the art and especially the science that goes into rum production. I'm fascinated by the production process and how tweaking all these individual variables impacts the flavor profile. And because I make transparency a very big part of what I do, I document and share every aspect of the rum making process. So hopefully you won't have any questions at all about how this rum was made. Hopefully this video is clear enough, but please feel free to ask me any questions at all. Now, my first batch of rum was called Baseline because, as the name suggests, it was and is intended to act as a baseline rum for all my other rums that are part of the variable line to be compared to. So it is a double pot distilled molasses based rum that's completely unaged, and to me it's pretty straightforward. And all the variable rums, all the batches that follow, have a variable changed in the production process so that you can directly see the impact that that variable has on the flavor profile of the rum. My first variable expression I called dunder clap because it had dunder added into the fermentation in place of water. And this batch, this expression that I have right here, is called tailspin. It's all about distillation, and it has tails added in to the distillation. So if you're one of my Patreons, you've been following along with the entire production process of this batch of tailspin, as well as my previous batches of rums as well. So I do want to give a huge shout out to you guys. Thank you so much. Now, if you, the viewer, would also like to support the channel and get behind the scenes looks at batches of rum that I'm working on, or videos that I'm creating, or new rums that I'm tasting, you can join us over on Patreon. I've got a link in the description below, and I would love it if you did. Now let's dive into how this expression tailspin was actually made. So unlike my previous two batches, right, baseline and variable dunder clap that were double pot distilled, tailspin is actually triple distilled with tails and dunder added into the second and third distillation. This was my way of mimicking what's happening in a double retort pot still without actually using a double retort pot still. I just have a standard pot still that I call Moira that I use for all my distillations. And we'll talk more about that later, but by recycling in tails and dunder, this allowed the flavor compounds that are in the tails and the dunder to get essentially a second chance at making it into the final spirit. Now, everything else within the production process was kept as consistent as possible from baseline and dunder clap. So it's fermented from 100% baking grade molasses, and like dunder clap, it has 33% dunder added into the fermentation. It's fermented for 18 to 20 days using Saccharomyces cerevisiae, more specifically the good old-fashioned Red Star distiller's yeast. And it is still an extremely small batch. This, however, has been the largest batch that I've made, clocking in at only 18 gallons of spirit at 75.8% ABV. Now, if you just jumped into my video here and haven't seen how I made baseline and how I made variable dunder clap, you can check out those videos in the description below. I'll leave links down there. But I'm going to talk you through how exactly I made tailspin, and we'll start with the fermentation. So I used 25 gallons of, as I said, baking grade molasses for this fermentation. And I was actually intending on making it a larger batch than that, and using more molasses. However, there was yet another molasses spill at FedEx. So I am so sorry, FedEx. I'm sure you guys hate me and the fact that I keep ordering molasses. So those 25 gallons of molasses were mixed with 41 gallons of dunder and 59 gallons of warm water for a total of 125 gallon fermentation. Adding in that warm water brought the whole fermentation mixture up to 81 degrees Fahrenheit. The starting specific gravity was 1.092, which was right in line with my other two batches. And I added in 1¼ cups of yeast, right? The dry active distiller's yeast from Red Star. And I wished the yeast happy snacking. And after 2 days, I came back and I added in 1⅓ cup of nutrients to kind of boost that activity, as I had done for my previous two batches. And I let it continue to ferment. And after 18 days, it was still active, which is crazy. But it had fermented down to a specific gravity of 1.014, and I was ready to distill. So I tossed it into the still anyways. That specific gravity would put the wash strength at about 10.2% ABV. So now on to distillation, the next step and the big variable in this batch that I manipulated. Because I had a 125 gallon fermentation and Moira is only 55 gallons, I had to split the first distillation into 3 runs. I cleaned out the still this morning, loaded it up with some wash, and just fired it up to do the first of 3 stripping runs. And it was your standard stripping run where only the wash was loaded up into the still. I collected about 37 gallons of low wines at 38% ABV, and then the next 2 distillations are where things get a little bit more complicated. As I mentioned, I wanted to simulate using a double retort pot still with just one single pot still. So I think we need to take a look at how exactly a double retort pot still works in order to kind of understand how my distillation kind of mimics that. So double retort pot stills are the quintessential rum pot still. It is a pot followed by 2 retorts, or for my home distillers out there, thumpers, that are in series. The pot is loaded up with wash, while the retorts are loaded up with late tails and early tails. As the pot is heated, the hot vapors from the pot still travel into the first retort, and then they heat up the liquid inside the first retort, and then those hot vapors travel into the second retort, which heats up the second retort, and then those hot vapors are condensed, and what you get is rum that has been enriched with the flavors of tails in only one single distillation. So being that I don't have a double retort pot still, this is my interpretation. My second distillation aimed to mimic what happens in the first retort, whereas my third distillation aims to mimic what happens in the second retort. So I took what I collected from the stripping run, which I refer to as low wines, and where this gets a little bit confusing is that low wines typically means late tails in the rum industry. But when I say low wines, I'm talking about what I collected from the stripping run. And when I'm referring to tails, early or late tails, I will call them early or late tails. So I took the 37 gallons of low wines that I collected from the first distillation and mixed that in with 8 gallons of late tails from my previous batches. I also wanted to bring down the ABV of that liquid, so I added in 5 gallons of dunder to bring that ABV down. Now, my other option was to add in water, but that's not as fun, so I went with dunder. And that gave me 50 gallons at 30% ABV. Now that mixture went into the still for my second distillation. And what I collected off the still was 25 gallons of what I'm referring to as high wines at 64% ABV. Again, calling this high wines is a little bit confusing because in the rum industry, this typically means early tails, but when I say early tails, I mean early tails, and high wines is what liquid came off of my second distillation. I hope this isn't confusing. To the 25 gallons of high wines, I added 6 gallons of early tales from my previous batches, as well as 19 gallons of dunder. There was a lot more dunder that went into this distillation because I needed to bring that ABV down. The ABV was at 64% once I mixed the tails and the high wines together. And I am not comfortable distilling anything above around 40% ABV. So I wanted to get that ABV down. And so I had to dilute it. Again, my option was diluting it with water or doing the more fun and flavorful thing and diluting it with dunder. So that mixture went into the still for my third and final distillation, where I collected tailspin. Now, I kept everything that I thought tasted delicious and good enough to make it into the final spirit. That meant for me taking about a 4-gallon heads cut and then collecting the next 18 gallons as tailspin at 75.8% ABV. I also collected a bunch of tails to use for future batches. Now, if all of this has been way too much to follow and send your brain into a tailspin, pun intended, all that you need to understand is that this method allowed me to layer in more complexity and flavor than doing a traditional kind of double pot still style of distillation. And although it's not an identical match to a double retort pot still, it is my interpretation. All in all, I bottled 60 375 milliliter bottles at still strength, 75.8% ABV, and 85 full 750 milliliter bottles at 49% ABV. And I wouldn't have been able to do any of this bottling without my good friend Mary, who you can barely see in this time lapse. So what does this taste like? What does variable tailspin taste like? Now, I tasted tailspin alongside baseline and dunderclap at still strength, and my Patreons got to see that video in full, but I'll include some highlights right here. I wanted to taste baseline, dunderclap, and what I have been calling tailspin side by side so that I can see the differences and I can convey to you the differences in the flavor profile of each one of these. We're going to start with baseline, obviously. So baseline, I think it's pretty clean. I get creamsicle. I also get whipped cream. There's key lime, a bit of a floral thing too. It's got this like minty-ish thing to it as well. And there's a sweet characteristic that's it's not quite caramel, but it's close. There's some white chocolate in here as well. So dunderclap, we'll move on to dunderclap. This is similar, but I get more fruit notes. There's like sweet apple, like a Honeycrisp apple, and maybe a little dried mango in here as well. There's also a floral thing, also a slight minty thing, some fig jam. That like sweet caramel thing presents now a little bit more like caramel, but it might still be on like the lighter end of a caramel. So we'll move on to variable tailspin. Wow. Okay, this smells so different. It's a lot sweeter. There's a lot more of like a rich creamsicle thing. I feel like I get like a juicy fruit gum as well. Now we're going barbecue. It's like sweet barbecue. No, that barbecue is going tangy now. A tangy like orange barbecue. There's a little bit of like a musky thing. And that mint thing has now almost turned into like eucalyptus, but almost like a soggy, borderline rotting eucalyptus. Yeah, there's like a woody characteristic to it, but like damp wood. Yeah, so very, very different. So we'll go palate, we'll go back to baseline here. So when I go back to the nose though, I get more of like a crisp like green apple and a little bit of cinnamon. So this has some heat that kind of slowly builds a little bit, but it's still, for 75, it's not bad. But I get this like royal icing thing along with fresh figs. And then towards the finish, it turns into like a little bit of grapefruit pith, like a little bit of a bitter, fruity thing. But yeah, clean, crisp. We're now on variable dunder clap, and we'll go ahead and see how it tastes on the palate. More fruits, dry fruits, golden raisins, fig jam. It's got a good oily mouthfeel. There's a little bit of spiciness that's kind of like maybe like a roasted cinnamon along with some cloves, maybe a little star anise, a little bit of a burnt caramel thing, and maybe a little bit of that grapefruit is still present, but it's much more like dried fruits, and a little bit of like sweet roastiness. The new batch, variable tailspin, that just, yeah, it smells very different. Also tastes very different. It's fruity and very sweet, and also has that like damp wood thing that comes forward. So those fruits have now turned darker, like some dried prunes. There's a little bit of a spice in there as well. Again, I'm getting like clove, a little bit of star anise. The caramel is now a little bit more of a burnt caramel, but it feels like there's just like more roastiness. I don't know, maybe some grilled fruits, like maybe some grilled peaches. But it's really fun. It's really fun how different it is, and I'm glad it is very different from the other two. With water, when it's proofed down to 49% ABV, I think it becomes fruitier on the nose. I get more like dried mango and creamsicle. There's also cinnamon peeking through along with those wet branches. And on the palate, it's more like dried figs and dried apples. I also get spices like cinnamon, allspice, and nutmeg. And then the burnt caramel and prune note comes more towards the finish. If you'd like to grab some bottles, currently it is available online and you can pick it up at the distillery, or I can ship anywhere in California. If you want bottles and don't live in California, come for a visit. Or I can ship bottles to your friend, family member, acquaintance, any contact you have in California that you trust to hold on to your bottles for you. Now, at the time that I'm posting this, Baseline is completely sold out. However, I'm working on getting another batch out soon, and there's limited availability of variable dunderclap. You can head over to my website, rumatelier.com, to get more information about my rums, and that will link you to Dead of Night's website, deadofnightdistillery.com, where you can actually buy bottles. But with that, I think that's all the information you could want to know about variable tailspin. We didn't even talk about the chemical analysis. That's available over on my website if you guys want me to go into a deep dive about the chemical analysis of baseline versus dunderclap versus tailspin. Please let me know. We can do that. But you can also just see the congener breakdown over on my website if you'd like. If you have any questions, please let me know. Don't hesitate to reach out. I can't wait to hear what you think of tailspin and how you think it compares to baseline and dunderclap. So let me show you how I stir my tote. This thing weighs a lot.